instead of investing in a very expensive facility in Baltimore that may have cost something like £9,000, the four of them buy property that's 10 miles distant in the Patapsco Valley that had not been developed. And it really shows how, in a way, entrepreneurial, and how much they were willing to take a chance. But they made a chance that was educated. They knew the environment. They knew how things were taking off. Remember the statistics I gave you about Baltimore growing. And so they buy this small tract of land that's bisected by the river, and then there's the odd shape up above it. And so they add a little bit later on, so they have about 135 acres. There's a rectangular tract at the bottom of the one that's outlined, and it goes up to the right, which is up east, up toward Catonsville now. And then the section that goes off to the left on the far side of the river, that odd shape, they bought the spaces in between that and started to head up the swale where modern-day Ellicott City is now. So it goes up the hill. So what they did was not just buy a mill site on the river, but they bought access to it. And there was no road there, so they built a road. And they controlled access then down to the area where their mill site would be. This is a later plat, but it illustrates, I've turned it on its side because the river on the left, that angle is what we just saw in the original plat. That's where Ellicott's Mills is. And then it starts on the right with Pratt Street and the Inner Harbor. So it's a road that links the Inner Harbor to the mills. And they were very much interested in tapping their facility into the existing highway network, and then ultimately improved it, which is when this plat was made. But what they did was, again, not just buy a mill seat and build a mill. They imagined the thing far more holistically as part of a much larger system. And so that's one of the things that the Maryland story can teach us about the development of industry in America, is that too often we have thought of it as the factory. And the factory actually doesn't stop at the threshold of the building. If you think of it kind of figuratively, it spreads out to include the systems of people who are involved to make the whole system work. So what the Ellicotts do is, first of all, understand connection. And the first thing they build is not a mill, but a road and a bridge to connect the Port of Baltimore with the expanding wheat territory that's going out west. So they position their mill very close to both of these important sites. This bridge is on the National Road, which continues the Baltimore and Frederick Turnpike west. It's not the bridge that the Ellicotts built, but I give it to you as an example. It's part of the road that ultimately their development led to. They also were interested in development on the Baltimore Harbor. Now, they didn't do that right away, but as soon as the Revolution was ended, they bought land on the Inner Basin and developed Ellicott's Dock. And there is still an Ellicott Street in downtown Baltimore about this long, and it's that upper part right in the middle. It's all been, the street at the top that angles down, that's the original boundary line, Water Street, the original boundary of the Inner Harbor that was then filled in, and the dock added so ships could come in the middle at the bottom and unload at various warehouses. So right off, they're thinking about the international connections that make the business work. And that's really made manifest in how they lay out their town, which I argue actually is a mill town before the fact. It has all of the features of the mill towns that we know from school and that we know from the New England story, but beginning in 1771. So this is the great pen and ink drawing by George Ellicott, and it shows the extent of Ellicott's Mills viewed from the Anne Arundel or Howard County side of the river over. And on the right is John Ellicott's house at the far end. To the next, the building that looks kind of like the mill I showed you, with a two-story with a little projecting hood over the door. That's a storehouse. Then the big merchant mill, then a sawmill, then a coal house, then a blacksmith shop, then a stable, and then Jonathan Ellicott's house. There are other houses that are built later, but this is the extent of things in the early 1780s. And there's more in Ellicott's Mills, which I'll tell you a little bit about, but this drawing is actually really critical to, as I said, to manifest the idea of the division of labor. So where at at William Moore's mills in Baltimore or Hood's mill up on the Patapsco, the miller did basically all this work or hired a few people to do it with him. The Ellicotts actually contracted out services. So they owned certain aspects of the business, but they also hired on people. And this is a critical difference between the plantation, the tobacco and iron plantation culture, which is slave-based. There's no incentive except for the planter to make money. Even if there was an extensive overwork system for slaves who worked in both plantations but also ironworks to work extra to earn spending money, they never were able to amass the capital to produce the kind of income that would generate urbanization. And so this is one of the critical differences regarding iron and tobacco versus industrial towns and wheat. Because wheat actually, what can you do with it? You can't just eat wheat. You could pull a tobacco leaf off and smoke it, but wheat has to be processed before you use it. And so by definition, wheat then requires a lot of ancillary labor. So it has to be ground by a miller into flour, or it has to be packed into barrels made by a cooper. It has to be shipped by a teamster who pulls a wagon made by a wheelwright. It has to be taken to a wharf at the city. It has to be handled by longshoremen. It has to be actually raised by a farmer way back to the west. And it all has to be linked together. So there's a whole network of individuals involved in getting wheat to the international market that didn't exist for tobacco. And another important difference is that all those people were American rather than British merchants. So the tobacco guys raised tobacco, they were American, sure enough, but the merchants they sold to were British, and the money stays there, or most of it, or with the big planter. So one of the things that is actually really interesting about wheat as a catalyst for urbanization is that it requires all of these extra things. And then you can imagine shipbuilders, and then you can imagine insurers, then you can imagine bankers. And so all of this begins to work together, as you can hopefully see, in a big system that actually promotes the kind of urbanization that I was just describing, that made Baltimore grow so much and also created these mill villages. So just very quickly, this is from adapted from an 1877 map of Ellicott City, and it shows north is going to the top. So the main part of Ellicott City crosses is on the section of the road going to the left after it crosses the river. The mills are down on the right, and then across the road were the houses of the Ellicotts and their store. The Ellicotts, when they built their town, didn't actually rely on an architect. They didn't have a standard grid like the little village of Elk Ridge Landing that I showed you. But just because they didn't employ Baroque design techniques doesn't mean that the village that they built was haphazard. It was actually very carefully controlled and thoughtfully laid out. And yes, it was opportunistic because it followed the meander of the river and also the line of the road, but it expressed a hierarchical community where everyone, kind of like the Newtonian universe, the clockwork universe, every piece all fits together in this rather beautifully conceived system. There are things that's also not true, but it was the thinking at the time. So on the right-hand side of the turnpike, there were the Ellicotts' houses, which were at the absolute peak of the architectural and social hierarchy. Next to them, between the road and the river, were the mill buildings, the industrial buildings. There was a house for a miller who rented out rooms to journeymen and apprentices. Across the river, I should say also there was a tannery, one of the associated businesses, the cooper shop, and the others that I've talked about. Crossing the river, and we don't know exactly where these were, but on either side there was a tavern with a big kitchen. There was another wheelwright shop, woodworker shop, and then if you go farther up the hill, almost in line with the avenue crossing the river, you can see the Friends Meeting House, Quaker Meeting House, and then a tiny square just directly above that on the left was a school. So pretty early on then, the Ellicotts have all of the features of basically of a town. So you have a store, you have ancillary services, you have a church, you have a school, and all of these things then blend together in a way that actually reflects this Quaker idea of community, but also of connection and factory systems as I should say, industrial systems as something more than a factory. I'll go quickly, I'm already running over a little bit, but so the Ellicott's house is across the road from the mills. The little one that's cut off on the left was the miller's house. That was a frame house. We have some other sources that give us information about the sizes of these buildings, and so we can calculate the amount of square footage for some of the range of wage earners. The Ellicott's earned wages, they earned the most from the Ellicott Company, but there were transient laborers who worked for them, also different people who had other positions I won't go into, but there is, what breaks out is a very, very clear hierarchy of spaces and materials and buildings as you ascend from a single cell, single room log house, 14 feet square, up to George Ellicott's house on the right, which is a really grand place. Even though it's kind of simple in design, don't be fooled by that. This old image of the Quaker Meeting House at the top of the hill. And I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the merchant mill itself, with the understanding that one can imagine this not simply as a factory or as a precursor to the factory form, but also as a machine in the whole town as a factory. So this building was exceptional for its time and period. It was about 36 feet wide, 100 feet long, twice the size of the standard merchant mill, like I showed the picture of to you, also twice the size of the Moore's Mills, paired mills. And basically what the Ellicotts did conceptually was to take those two mills at Moore's Mills and join them into one. So it's actually one big rectangular structure. It's made of stone. It probably has a frame gable. You see on the gable end the line, horizontal line below the three windows. That suggests to me a difference in material on the walls. As you follow the gable down on the left, you can see two dormers at either end, and then a kind of a rectangular feature in the center, which is actually a large overhanging dormer that opens up to windows underneath. So it's how you get material in through hoists into this building. Interestingly, the Ellicotts opted not to build an internal mill wheel like the Pennsylvania type. They built an exterior one, figuring, I suppose, that building a large building, a large mill structure was a big investment of money. They built far larger than they needed. They had only 2 pairs of millstones, and there was space for many, many more to be put in, which eventually were toward the end of the century. And I think they opted to put the mill wheel outside, figuring that it'd be cheaper to replace it than to take up space inside that they might need later for grinding. I have a few historic shots of mills. This is one that will give you a rough idea of what it might have looked like. It was probably bigger than this. It's a Pennsylvania mill. I don't have the name handy. This one clearly had an internal wheel. You see the arch where the mill race would have come out, but it has this big side dormer above a door, and then a lower door which has been sealed up, but to lift bags of wheat in. I should say too very quickly that one of the interesting things about architectural history is that we are tempted, like the New England historians did, to see something that's small, see it get bigger, assume everybody knows how the story ended up when it started out. But that's actually not the case. These mills, like the Ellicott's mills, were 2-story with a half floor above in the garret, and all of the work was done by hand except for grinding. So the millers and the journeymen and the apprentices carried sacks, they raked, they swept things out. When the flour came off the stones, it was hot and moist, and they had to spread it out in the garret in an open on the floor so it would dry out and not spoil. Hence the frame gables, I think, allowed air to penetrate more easily. And all of this changed in the 1790s with Oliver Evans' patent for a mechanized system. And so all that removed the human hand from it, basically, and so someone could empty wheat in one end, and it would come out flour in the other, already packed in a barrel, all done by mechanization. And what that permitted merchant millers to do was to build much smaller buildings than the Ellicotts. So the Ellicotts were banking on something that actually changed within 20 years after they built their building. Millers could build buildings on a smaller footprint and taller because it was a machine that was raising things up. And the machine can go up much more easily. Pull on a hoist system or pulleys can pull things up much more quickly and efficiently than people trudging up the stairs. So merchant mill forms change. Another mill with the side dormer and the frame gable, also from Pennsylvania. This is a Maryland mill, and I show it to you because it has the paired dormers like the Ellicotts did. And if we return to John Moll's drawing, this large building in the center with the doors on the side and the two dormers was the Tobacco Inspection House in Baltimore in the 1750s. And so in thinking about how the Ellicotts got the idea to build their big mill, they took from their own experience. So Pennsylvania mill features, also features from large open structures that a mill would need to be like a tobacco inspection house, and with the dormer windows. So this Ellicott Mills then, with the highway and the bridge across the river, became a nexus for urban development. And I'll try to go through this quickly now. Very soon after the Ellicott's Mills took off, this rather blurry image is from the bird's eye view of the Patapsco that's actually on the cover of the book. And the building in the center, just to the left of the bridge, is the first major mill that was built in the valley after the Ellicotts began their work. So this is 1794. It's a paper mill. It's about the same size as the Ellicott's factory, a little bit larger, 38 feet by 100. It's stone. It's 3 stories tall. 1794, 3-story, big stone building. Slater's small frame building. It's not part of a progression that goes very easily from small frame to large frame to brick to stone and so on. So already the Maryland story is beginning to tell us that the neat New England line is not exactly what it appears to be. In the mid-1790s, the Ellicotts themselves expanded. This is another Francis Guy painting of Jones Falls, so I show it to you only as a suggestion. The big building on the right is a large merchant mill that was constructed right at the beginning of the 19th century. The Ellicotts also built large mills even bigger than this on Gwynn's Falls in the 1790s. 4-story brick buildings, about I think about 40 by 80 feet. So yet again, larger but taller, reflecting the change in technology. Back at Ellicott's Mills themselves, the Ellicotts invested in the rolling mill and ironworks. This is the view from the bridge crossing the Patapsco. The merchant mill is down to the right. This is from the 1820s. And of course, I couldn't get by without mentioning Charles's favorite place, the Union Manufacturing Company of Maryland, the great textile emplacement built on the river in 1808. So over this 20-year period, then you can begin to see the town of Ellicott's Mills expanding out in a kind of a sinuous, meandering way along the river. It's not the same kind of dense development that occurred in the heart of Baltimore, or the kind of massive, huge factory development that occurred in New England, but it's its own kind of industrial community. Just to put this into the New England framework, this is 1808, after Slater, but before Waltham, before Lowell. And when the Union directors built the second factory in 1813, this is just a larger view of that mill, the original mill and the mill village with it. The second mill with this one had the largest productive capacity for cotton textiles in the nation for 2 years, 1814, 1815. Then there was a terrible fire, burned the first mill, and it never recovered. It did continue to operate, but not at the level that had originally been planned. And one of the reasons that it didn't recover as fully and as quickly is because you see the building to the left of the large factory in the center? That's this place, which was photographed in the 1930s before it was torn down when the Oella factory was built. This photograph is identified as a carpenter shop, the Union Manufacturing Company carpenter shop. But actually it wasn't a carpenter shop. It was a weaving mill. Because before Francis Cabot Lowell put the power loom in the factory at Waltham in 1813, all weaving was done by hand. And sometimes, like Samuel Slater did in Rhode Island, he put it out to families who wove it and then returned it to him. Sometimes in big enterprises like the Union Manufacturing Company, they built a separate mill for the weavers to be under more ready control of the owners. So the reason that Union never took off to the degree that the New England mills did is because they didn't have power looms. They were just a little bit ahead, and I should say a little bit behind the curve there. when they began their operation. But very soon, after the power loom began to take off, they installed them, and other textile magnates invested in the valley. So this is what was the Patapsco cotton factory just downstream from Ellicott's mills. It's at the site of the old paper mill. So they took the paper mill and turned it into workers' housing, built a large mill on the same scale as the Union Manufacturing Company factories. It burned, like so many of them did, and then it was rebuilt on a smaller scale, which is what you see in the drawing here. I mean, in the photograph here. Later still, the Thistle Mill in this picture from the 1930s, after its roof has been taken off in the middle of a renovation project, but another large stone factory on the Union model, with ultimately with power looms added. So Ellicott City then, here in the 1820s, and it's very faint, I know, but the tall building with the gable in the center, that's the Ellicott's replacement mill. Their original mill, the big, long, low one, burned in 1809, and they rebuilt it on a smaller footprint, higher, because the technology that Oliver Evans had invented, they were able to use. And it's that model, like Francis Cabot Lowell's fully integrated system for textile production, it's that model and this model that take off. So one last view, Ellicott City in the mid-19th century, with the railroad coming through on the left. That occurs right at the very end of the period that I dealt with, but it opens up a whole new era of industrialization and urbanization, which is another story. I encourage you to take a look at the Thomas Viaduct if you haven't, which is a very important artifact from this last period. Okay, thank you very much.
We're very, very grateful. And I would like to give the folks an opportunity to ask some questions, if you had any, just so that, yes, sir?
I have just a simple question. I'm a retired doctor. One of my former patients named Webb, his father worked for Dickey, and he said at the end of the day they converted the power from the Dickey mill over to run electricity in the evening to power Ellicott City. So during the day they ran the textiles. Now my guess, this man's been dead 20 years, I guess we're talking early 1900s, but he said that was one of his dad's jobs. He was an engineer. At the end of the day, make sure they switch the power over to electrify the city. So that's...
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's certainly right at this point at the end of the 19th century that electrification begins to take place. And one of the ancillary facilities in Ellicott City called the oil mill, it was a linseed oil mill, that site was turned into an electric power generating plant, I think in the 1880s, 1890s. And one of the reasons that factories built their own power plants is that electricity was not reliable enough, the current not strong enough or not regular enough. And so this was a way for the Dickey Company to ensure that it had its proper supply. And then also to...
Kind of win-win for the city.
Yes, exactly, you think.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
They actually sold electricity. You eloquently described the connectiveness, the urbanization, the technology, the innovation. There's probably synergy involved in that.
Yeah.
What comes to mind in the contemporary situation is technology corridor. And in a sense, could this be the mother of all tech corridors?
Well, in a way it is. I mean, there was, I guess one of the things that I'm trying to get at with thinking about the Industrial Revolution as more than a factory building is that it's more of a mentality. So what the Ellicotts did was actually not originate. I mean, they didn't clear the Patapsco Valley of tobacco production. They recognized trends that were already in place, and they knew how to capitalize on them with youthful energy and a sense of opportunity and innovation. So I think actually there's a good parallel.
Listen.
If I'm correct, I believe you described fields surrounding the mills at Ilchester?
Yes,
Which side of the river would that be on?
Oh.
Because I can't picture any.
right, it's probably all overgrown now
Well,
with
it's very
forest.
hilly is what I'm.
Yeah, it's, if you head back from the river, so that patent, Talbot's Last Shift, was, let's see, do you know the house Rockland, which is a little bit further down? It was the old Dorsey house that is back on the ridge on the south side of the Patapsco, at the southern end of Patapsco Park.
Rockland or Rockburn?
Rockburn,
Yeah.
excuse me, Rockburn.
Yes.
It's a Rockland in Virginia, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know Rockburn.
So Rockburn, right.
Yeah.
So, and it's Rockburn Branch that Caleb Dorsey builds the original ironworks on. But if you go back from the valley, it's rolling, but it tends to flatten out, and so you go basically west and north from that. It's above the steep drop at Ilchester. Sure.
Oh, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything left of the Elk Ridge Ironworks, the furnace? besides
Well, that's a
that?
good question, because in the book, I made a mistake. And, and some other historians before me did. Because you hear Elk Ridge Furnace, and you think, well, it should be in Elk Ridge. It should be in the town of Elk Ridge. And there was a furnace in Elk Ridge, but it's not Caleb Dorsey's furnace. There's a furnace there that was built in the 18th century that was his son, Samuel's. And it was an air furnace that was used to take pigs and to melt it into iron to be cast. So it didn't need a dam, and it didn't need a water wheel to drive any of the machinery. So there are the buildings in Elk Ridge that are related to the later ironworks that were there. But as far as I know, there aren't any remains of the original furnace. I will say that despite my walking up and down the river, I never did walk up Rockburn Branch. And it would be very interesting to walk up there, because that's where the site was. And maybe you'll find some stones. Cut stones were valuable. When the iron furnace ceased to exist, it's very likely they were, quarried away and used by other people in building. Yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering, with the Ellicotts being Quakers, I guess they probably wouldn't be slaveholders. So their relations with the African American community, how different was that from non-Quakers?
Well, actually pretty different. I don't know the full trajectory of Quaker history, but there is, I'll say, a Quaker miller who built a mill at Ilchester in the 1730s. And that mill, of course, no longer survives, but the inventory of it does. And it lists, like the one at the Talbot place, it lists an earth-fast house, and it lists quantities of tobacco produced. And the will for that estate also lists slaves that are given to various members of the family. So here's a Quaker early on who owns slaves and raises tobacco. At some point, I understand, in Quaker theological development, it became more widespread to not hold slaves. And so I think that's one of the key distinctions between that community and the old school tobacco plantations that had existed already for 100 years. And I think it highlights the difference in development. So the tobacco system didn't produce any kind of urbanization in a major way, whereas the wage-based flour milling industry tended to produce industrial villages and then large-scale urban development on a scale not known in the tobacco period. I don't know specifically. One of the problems is the Ellicotts were very laconic, so I don't have any letters, and I have access to a few of the ledgers that deal with the business, and so they do trade with African Americans that are noted as mulatto or colored. But I don't have any sense of what they felt personally, just that they didn't own slaves.
We have one final question, if I may, over here.
Okay.
You mentioned that the ironworks were placed kind of around an agricultural model initially, and I had the impression that pre-revolutionary that it was against the law in the colonies to have ironworks, and they were placed so they wouldn't be discovered.
Well, it's not that ironworks per se were against the law, but they were restricted by British mercantile policy to produce certain things. And one of the objects was that they not produce finished goods that would compete with British finished good makers. So in theory, and it only worked in theory, the colonies were to be a source of raw material, all of which would go to England and then be returned to us in the form of finished products. So there were ironworks as, I think the earliest in the colonies is 1718, which is the Principio Works, and that's set up by British investors. And so ironworks